We are here today at a workshop on elites, knowledge and power in China. Yeah, and so we are doing a series of interviews, and you are the first one we are interviewing. So on this podcast, we are interested in having academics tell us about their career trajectories, as you know, just to share some things that normally may not be known by young people, and you know, to share some stories about how your life is intertwined with your research teams, and you know, things like that some people don't necessarily know about academic work.
Okay.
So for start, can you tell me how you decided to become an academic?
Did
Did you decide it? Or?
No, I did decide.
Yeah.
Because I used to be a banker.
Oh.
Yeah, so my undergraduate degree is in finance. When I went to college, the United States was in the middle of an economic recession, and there was very little employment for academics. So I wanted to be an academic, but all of my professors told me no. You should not be an academic. You'll never find a job. It's a complete hopeless mess. And so I got a degree in finance and went to work for a bank in San Francisco, which was actually a subsidiary of BNP, which is now BNP Paribas. But at that time, it was just BNP. So I worked there for 6 years. And I had never been to China. I spoke absolutely no Chinese. But I kind of wanted to be a historian. And so I began reading articles that said that they were going to start hiring professors again. That, you know, the children of the baby boom were going to go to college.
So that was in which years?
So this would have been about 1980.
Okay.
Yeah. Okay. Maybe a little bit later. I'm sorry, about 1986. Okay. So I thought, well, maybe I should go back to graduate school. So when I was an undergraduate, I'd taken one class in Chinese history just for fun. And so I wrote my professor. Of course, there was no internet, no email at the time. And he wrote back to me, he called me when I was at the bank. And he said, well, if you want to be a historian, you have to choose a field. And I was so stupid. I had no idea how to be an academic. I'm not from an academic family. I said, oh, well, maybe I'll do China. And so this was, 1986, 1987. China was not China, right? No one predicted this huge economic growth. No one predicted it would be the world's second largest economy.
It's difficult to go to China, too.
Yeah, it was very difficult. But it was in the news, and it just seemed interesting. And so I applied to some schools and quit my job and went back to graduate school.
Okay, and so what was your PhD thesis on?
So my PhD thesis was related to my background, actually. I worked on financial crises in early 20th century China in the 1910s, 20s, and 30s, and how responses to these crises changed state-society relations.
Okay, and so what did you learn from this first research experience? PhD is usually like a big thing.
Yeah. So, what did I learn academically, or what did I learn personally?
In general, I mean, okay. What do you remember most from this experience as growth?
Yeah. I mean, one of the things I learned was that persistence pays off. Mm-hmm. I was at the archives in China for a year and a half, and the longer you're there, the more you get to see. They become much more fond of you after a long time in the archives. And I also learned how much fun it was looking at documents that no one has looked at in 30 years or 40 years and trying to find out, put together the story from these little bits and pieces and these little hits. And then trying to do so in a way that no one had thought of before. So my book is about trust. And some people have written about trust in China. most famously a man named Francis Fukuyama, who classified China as a low trust society, which I find condescending and not based in any sort of empirical research, right? Although Sun Yat-sen said almost the same thing, in fairness. And so just the idea of trying to find out, because of course people trust, you can't have a society without trust. So how did they build trust? Why did people trust the money, or why did they not trust the money? And why did people trust banks? And what could bankers do, or local elites do, or governments do to try to reinforce that trust, or to create a condition for trust?
And yeah, Francis Fukuyama's End of History was a big thing at that time.
Yeah, this is a different book that he wrote.
And he wrote a different book?
He had an earlier book he wrote called Trust.
Okay, and so what was it target for you? Like, was this something you wanted to...
It became a target, but that's not why I chose the topic.
Okay. And is there a specific reason why you chose this topic?
Yeah, so I was reading a book by a man named... just like that. David Strand, called Peking... what is it called? Beijing. Anyway, it's a book about Beijing in the Republican period. I'll think of the title in a moment. Rickshaw Beijing. Rickshaw Beijing. Yeah. And in the book, there's a very short description of a bank run where the bankers, the merchants who refused to accept bank notes, at that time, paper money was issued by banks in China. It wasn't directly related to the government. So that there was this crisis and people stopped trusting these banknotes. And so this was seen as unpatriotic by some people. And so there were merchants who were marched through the streets with signs around their necks calling them traitors because they refused to accept this one kind of money. And that story I said, what's going on here? Because these are the kinds of stories we read about for the Cultural Revolution, for the 1960s, not for the 1910s and 1920s. And so that sparked my interest. And I didn't really think of it as a history of banking at the time. I thought of it as a history of sort of political action. But it sort of led me back to banking. And that obviously is influenced by my early training.
Yeah, and did you ever draw parallels with what you knew about banking in the US, for example?
I mean, my banking knowledge certainly helped me understand things that I wrote. Parallels, I don't like to draw facile parallels between my life in the 1980s and China in the 1910s and 1920s, but certainly an understanding of how banks work and, that kind of thing really, really helped.
Okay. And so after that, did you stay on this subject, or did you study other aspects of Chinese history?
No, so that was my first book. And then after that, for my next topic, I looked at an industrialist in the same city. It's a city of North China called Tianjin. And it's a family, a father and son, who ran their businesses under 5 successive authoritarian regimes, mutually hostile authoritarian regimes. And they had good relations with all of them, at least for a while, with the communists. And so I thought of it as a way of looking at the relationship between authoritarianism and capitalism through the perspective of one family. And so many books on this period of China. This is a period of China where there's much political upheaval. And so there's many different governments that rule China or try to rule China. And most books look at one of those periods. But people's lives didn't stop and end when one government fell and another one came in. So by following this family, I could see the lived experience of the first half of the 20th century. Although it was incredibly difficult because every one of those governments, those 5 different governments, had a different archive and a different resource base. But I tried to treat each one equally and show sort of how capitalists related to the government in each, the warlords, the nationalists, the Japanese occupation, the post-war nationalists, and then the early communists.
And so, so the theme of the workshop is elites. And
yes.
So how are elites important in your own research? How is this concept important for you to understand Chinese history?
Not.
Or not? Yeah. How? So it's not.
Well, it is important. I mean, because I look at business people and the relationship between business, society, and the state. And so by definition, they are somehow elite. They have more income or more assets or more influence than average people. And so trying to understand their position, in the first book on trust, their position between everyday people who are using money and a state who has certain goals for what the banks do. They had this kind of interesting intermediary position where they were trying to carve out a space of autonomous professionalism, where they said, you will trust us because we are professionals, and the state can't, we will fend off the state and its desire for money. And in the second case, with the authoritarianism and capitalism, once again, these are people who are very poor, and who sort of emerged and built their companies over time and tried to become elites, very, very self-consciously. And what that meant to them, and what sort of gaining that kind of status and that sort of economic power meant to them, and how it was so difficult in this very tumultuous time in China.
Okay. So do you have some specific feedback about today's workshop, or what do you think of the
No, this is terrific. I had almost given up on my work on bankers. I have this big database where I have information on 6,000 different bankers from the early 20th century in China. And because I'd sort of moved on from banking, I haven't thought about it in a long time. But now that I'm back and sort of thinking about how you use data and how we can think of new methodologies to inform history, and with some of the new advances that have been made in database management, I think this has been very useful for me.
Yeah. And do you have a more general advice for people interested in going into academia?
Don't do it. Don't do it unless it's the only thing that's going to make you happy.
Right? It's a very good advice.
Good.
Yeah.